At my husband's family reunion, his aunt looked me up and down, gestured toward my daughter, and asked the question she'd apparently been wondering all afternoon. "So are you the nanny, or—" 20 people within earshot went quiet, waiting to see how I'd handle it. I opened my mouth to answer, but my 7-year-old daughter got there first. "She's not the nanny," she said, loud and clear, looking directly at the aunt like she'd said something genuinely strange. "She's Dr. Reyes. She's my mom, and she does surgery on people's hearts. If you've ever been reduced to something smaller than you are by people who never bothered to actually ask, stay with me. Because what happened in the next 30 seconds at that reunion is one of the most quietly perfect corrections I've ever witnessed, and it came from someone who wasn't even 4 feet tall. My name is Priya, and I married into a family that had, from the very beginning, a particular set of assumptions about who belonged in it. My husband, Chris, comes from a large, close-knit family, the kind with an annual reunion that draws 60 or 70 relatives from 4 different states, a family with deep roots in the same small town for 3 generations, a family where everyone generally knows everyone else's business and has known it for decades. I am not from that town. I'm not, as it happens, the same race as most of that extended family, a fact that I want to name plainly here because it matters to understanding some of what happened, even though I want to be careful not to reduce this entire story to that single dimension. I'm the daughter of immigrants who came to this country in the early 80s, and I grew up in a considerably more diverse city, 4 states away from the small town where Chris's family had lived for generations. When Chris and I got married, 7 years before the reunion I'm about to describe, I met his extended family for the first time at our wedding. A whirlwind of names and faces I couldn't possibly retain in a single afternoon, most of whom I wouldn't see again until the following year's reunion, and many of whom I genuinely wouldn't see again for years at a stretch, given the geographic distance and the specific rhythm of a family that gathered in full only once annually. I want to be fair to this family, because the story I'm about to tell isn't really about overt cruelty. It's about something quieter and, in some ways, more insidious. The specific way a large, insular family can simply fail to update its understanding of a newer member, year after year, especially when that member doesn't fit the mental picture the family had, consciously or not, of what a Reyes family spouse was supposed to look like. Over the 7 years of our marriage, I attended 4 of these annual reunions, missing a few due to my work schedule, which is itself a detail worth pausing on, since my work schedule was, in fact, considerably demanding for reasons that had nothing to do with childcare. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I completed a rigorous undergraduate program, medical school, a general surgery residency, and then a specialized cardiothoracic fellowship. Nearly 14 years of training after high school before I began practicing independently. By the time of the reunion I'm describing, I had been operating independently for 6 years, performing complex heart surgeries, including a specialized valve repair technique that only a handful of surgeons in our entire region were trained to perform. I mention these specifics not to boast, but because I want you to understand exactly how far the assumption I'm about to describe had drifted from reality. At the first reunion I attended, shortly after our wedding, I was introduced by Chris, correctly, as my wife, Priya. She's a surgeon. I remember this introduction landing, at the time, with a kind of polite, slightly confused nodding from several relatives. The specific nodding of people who register information without quite processing its full weight, distracted by the general chaos of a large family gathering. At subsequent reunions, attended more sporadically due to my demanding schedule, I noticed a pattern developing that I initially dismissed as simple forgetfulness. Relatives who'd ask, again, what I did, as though the information had never been shared, or asking Chris directly, in front of me, some version of, "And what does Priya do again?" The specific question people ask when they've filed you under a category that doesn't require detailed follow-up. By the 3rd reunion, our daughter Maya had been born, and I noticed the assumptions shifting in a specific, uncomfortable direction. Several relatives, upon seeing me at family gatherings primarily in the context of caring for Maya, since I often arrived slightly late from work commitments, or needed to step away briefly for a work call even during vacation time, appeared to have quietly filed me under a category that made intuitive sense to them, given their limited direct information about my actual profession, some kind of caregiver, rather than a physician who happened to also be an attentive mother. I want to be honest about something that I think matters considerably to how this misunderstanding calcified so completely. My absence from 2 consecutive reunions, due to genuinely demanding surgical rotations that made travel impossible, likely accelerated the family's confusion rather than simply pausing it. During those 2 years I couldn't attend, Chris went to the reunions with Maya alone, given my inability to take the time off. I don't know exactly what assumptions calcified during those 2 years in my absence, but I have some educated guesses, based on what eventually surfaced at the reunion I'm about to describe in detail. Chris, to his credit, has never been anything but proud of my career. He introduces me correctly, consistently, and has never contributed to any confusion about what I do for a living. But I think, in a large, sprawling family that gathers in full only once a year, information that isn't actively, repeatedly reinforced tends to fade, replaced by whatever surface-level impression a relative happened to form during a brief, distracted encounter years earlier. By the time of the reunion I'm about to describe, my first in 3 years, following those 2 missed gatherings, I suspect a fairly significant portion of Chris's extended family had settled into a vague, half-remembered impression of me as simply Chris's wife who takes care of their daughter, without any clear, current understanding of my actual profession at all. The reunion that year took place at a large lakeside park the family had used for this gathering for as long as anyone could remember. The same pavilion, the same volleyball net, the same specific arrangement of folding tables that had apparently remained unchanged across multiple decades of this family's tradition. I arrived with Chris and Maya, now 7 years old, on a warm Saturday afternoon, greeted with the specific, slightly overwhelming warmth this family always extended toward gatherings, hugs from relatives I only vaguely recognized, questions about the drive, the specific chaos of dozens of children running between tables, while adults caught up on a year's worth of separate lives. I want to describe the specific moment that became the centerpiece of this story, because the build-up to it matters. I had been standing near the food table for a few minutes, helping Maya prepare a plate, when Chris's Aunt Deborah, his father's older sister, a woman I'd met perhaps 3 times total across 7 years of marriage, approached with the specific, unhurried curiosity of someone examining an unfamiliar addition to a family gathering. "You're Chris's," she started, then paused, clearly searching for the right word, her eyes moving between me and Maya with a specific, assessing quality. "You're with the kids today?" "I'm actually Chris's wife," I said, keeping my tone light. "Maya's mom." Deborah's expression shifted into something that suggested this information genuinely surprised her. "Oh, I'm sorry, she gestured vaguely between Maya and me, a gesture that seemed to be searching for some explanation for a mismatch she clearly perceived, though she never stated it directly. "I guess I just assumed, since you're usually with her, and Chris mentioned they had someone helping out while he's at work sometimes." I want to pause here and explain something important. Chris had, in fact, mentioned to some relatives, in a completely unrelated context, that we occasionally used after-school care for Maya during periods when both our schedules were demanding, an entirely accurate, unremarkable detail about typical dual-career parent logistics. Somewhere in the family's collective, imprecise memory, this detail appeared to have merged with their vague uncertainty about my actual role, producing a garbled impression that I might, in fact, be that caregiver, rather than Maya's mother and a practicing physician. "I think there might be some confusion," I said, still keeping my tone even, genuinely more curious at this point than offended. "I'm Maya's mother. I'm also a surgeon. I work at Memorial Regional." Deborah's expression shifted again, this time into something that looked like polite disbelief, rather than outright correction. "Oh, of course," she said, in the specific tone people use when they're humoring a claim they don't entirely credit. That's wonderful." It was at this point that Deborah's sister, a woman named Patricia who'd been listening to this exchange from a few feet away, approached and asked the question that gives this story its title. "So are you the nanny, or?" Patricia asked, gesturing toward Maya with a genuinely curious, entirely unguarded expression. The specific question of someone who has decided, based on some combination of assumption and half-remembered detail, that this is the most plausible explanation for the woman standing in front of her. I felt the specific sting of that question land, Not because it was delivered with any obvious malice. I want to be fair to Patricia here, because I genuinely believe her question came from confused assumption rather than deliberate cruelty, but because it represented, distilled into a single sentence, an accumulated 7 years of a family failing to actually see me clearly. Several relatives standing nearby had gone quiet, waiting to see how I'd respond, the specific charged quiet of a group sensing an awkward moment unfolding in real time. I opened my mouth to answer, already forming some measured, patient correction I'd delivered variations of throughout the earlier part of that afternoon. But Maya answered first. "She's not the nanny," my 7-year-old daughter said, her voice clear and entirely matter-of-fact, looking up at Patricia with the specific, genuine confusion of a child encountering an idea that simply doesn't match her own understanding of reality. "She's Doctor Reyes. She's my mom, and she does surgery on people's hearts." I want to describe what happened in the several seconds following Maya's correction, because it's the moment this entire story pivots around. Patricia's expression shifted through a rapid, visible sequence. Confusion first, as she processed a 7-year-old's confident, unhesitating correction, then something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine embarrassment as the full weight of her earlier question registered. "She does surgery?" Patricia repeated, looking at me directly now for the first time with what seemed like genuine, unguarded curiosity rather than the vague, assessing look she'd extended a moment earlier. "Heart surgery," I said, and I want you to notice that I said this plainly, without the specific self-minimizing tone I might have used earlier in the conversation. Some quiet confidence borrowed, in that moment, from my daughter's own unhesitating clarity. "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've been practicing for 6 years. Deborah, who had initiated the earlier confusion, looked between Maya and me with an expression that had shifted entirely from polite disbelief into something considerably more humbled. "I had absolutely no idea," she said. "I'm so sorry, Priya. I think I've been carrying around some completely wrong picture of you this whole time." I want to walk through what happened over the remainder of that afternoon, because the shift that followed Maya's correction rippled through the reunion in a way I hadn't anticipated. Deborah, visibly embarrassed by her earlier assumption, mentioned the exchange to several other relatives throughout the following hour. Not maliciously, I don't think, but simply as an interesting, slightly mortifying anecdote about a misunderstanding that had apparently persisted, uncorrected, for years. By the time we sat down for the reunion's communal dinner, several relatives I'd barely interacted with in previous years approached me with genuine, newly curious questions about my actual profession. Chris's uncle Robert, a retired general practitioner who had, until that afternoon, apparently shared the same vague uncertainty about my role as the rest of the family, sought me out specifically, clearly professionally intrigued once he understood my actual specialty. "Cardiothoracic," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That's some of the most demanding training in the entire field. I had no idea. Chris never really elaborated, and I think I just assumed." "You assumed the version that fit whatever picture you already had," I said, not unkindly, but honestly. "That's been happening for about 7 years now, apparently." I want to describe Chris's response to all of this because I think it matters to understanding the full picture of what had happened and what needed to change going forward. Chris had been at a different part of the reunion during the initial exchange with Deborah and Patricia, occupied with a group of his cousins, and only learned about what had happened once Maya, proud of her own correction, recounted the story to him directly, with the specific, delighted energy of a child who knows she's said something important. "Dad, Aunt Patricia thought Mom was the nanny," Maya told him, practically bouncing with the telling of it. "I told her Mom's a doctor and does surgery on hearts." I watched Chris's expression shift into something between amusement at Maya's confident delivery and a more serious, uncomfortable recognition of what the underlying confusion actually revealed about his family's collective blind spot. "I should have said something sooner," Chris told me later that evening, once we were back at our hotel, Maya finally asleep after an exhausting day of reunion activities. "I've always introduced you correctly, but I think I never really pushed back when people didn't seem to register it, or when the information didn't seem to stick. I just let it slide, year after year, and I didn't realize how much it had actually calcified into something this wrong." "It's not entirely your fault," I said, though I appreciated him naming it directly. But I do think it's worth understanding why nobody in your family ever really pushed to update their picture of me, especially once Maya was born. I think some part of it is just that a woman who's usually seen with her child gets filed under caregiver by default, in a way that a man in the identical situation probably wouldn't be. I want to be honest about a dimension of this story that I think matters, even though it's uncomfortable to name directly. I don't think the assumption that I was the nanny existed entirely independent of other factors about how I looked, compared to the overwhelmingly white extended family I'd married into. I'm not accusing anyone at that reunion of deliberate racism. I want to be careful and precise about that, because I don't believe Patricia's question, or Deborah's earlier confusion, came from a place of conscious hostility. But I do think it's worth acknowledging that the specific assumption defaulted to nanny rather than, say, Chris's sister, or a family friend, or any number of other roles that wouldn't have carried the same particular history, likely reflected some unconscious pattern matching that I don't think this family had ever been forced to examine directly before that afternoon. I raised this, gently, with Chris later that evening, and I want to be fair to him. He didn't get defensive, and he didn't try to explain it away entirely. "I think you're probably right that it's part of it," he said. "I don't think anyone in my family would consciously endorse that assumption if you asked them directly. But I also think the fact that nobody bothered to actually learn or remember your profession, year after year, probably has more to do with unconscious bias than anyone in my family would be comfortable admitting." The months following that reunion brought a noticeable, if gradual, shift in how Chris's extended family engaged with me. Deborah, in particular, made a point of reaching out directly a few weeks later, sending a genuinely thoughtful message acknowledging her embarrassment about the assumption and asking real, substantive questions about my work. Questions considerably more detailed than anything she'd asked across the previous 7 years combined. At the following year's reunion, I noticed a specific, deliberate change. Chris's mother, apparently having heard about the incident secondhand, made a point of introducing me to several relatives who hadn't been present the previous year. Explicitly and correctly, "This is Priya, Chris's wife. She's a cardiothoracic surgeon at Memorial Regional." The specific, deliberate correctness of this introduction, repeated consistently throughout that following reunion, felt like a genuine, if belated, course correction from a family finally taking seriously the responsibility of actually seeing a newer member clearly. Maya, for her part, has told the story of the time Aunt Patricia thought Mom was the nanny, more times than I can count in the time since, always with the same proud, matter-of-fact delivery she used in the original moment. A 7-year-old's unhesitating clarity about who her mother actually was, entirely unclouded by the specific, accumulated confusion the adults around her had somehow allowed to persist for years. I think about that reunion often, and about the specific power embedded in Maya's simple, unhesitating correction, a correction that landed with more clarity and more immediate impact than any explanation I might have offered myself in that same moment. I think there's something worth examining in the fact that it took a child's plain, unfiltered honesty to cut through years of adult assumption that had somehow never been directly challenged. Adults, I think, often develop a specific tolerance for ambiguous, half-formed impressions of people who don't fit neatly into their existing categories. We let vague assumptions slide, year after year, out of politeness or distraction, or simply not caring enough to actually ask the direct question. Children haven't yet learned that particular tolerance. Maya simply knew the truth, and stated it plainly, without any of the social hesitation that might have led an adult in her position to let the moment pass uncorrected. I don't think every misunderstanding requires a 7-year-old to swoop in and correct it for you, but I do think there's a lesson in the specific power of stating a plain truth clearly, without hedging, without the specific social softening adults often apply to avoid discomfort. Maya didn't soften her correction to spare Patricia's feelings. She simply said what was true, and the clarity of that statement did more to correct 7 years of accumulated misunderstanding than any explanation I could have constructed myself. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been reduced to something smaller than you actually are by people who never bothered to really look at you, I want you to remember something. You don't have to soften the truth about who you are to make other people comfortable with their own assumptions. Sometimes the clearest, simplest statement of the truth is more powerful than any explanation, and sometimes the people who love you most will say that truth on your behalf, exactly when you need it, without you even having to ask. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, has anyone ever assumed something completely wrong about you based on nothing more than a surface-level glance? I read every single comment, and I've got more stories like this one coming every week.